What if I told you that while organizing my late grandmother's papers, I found a death certificate with my exact name, birth date, and social security number, issued by St. Mary's General Hospital on the same day I was supposedly born there 28 years ago? If you want to discover how this impossible situation really happened, hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will leave you speechless. And tell me in the comments, what would you do in this situation? The October rain drummed against the windows of my grandmother's Chicago brownstone as I sat surrounded by decades of paperwork. Margaret Chen had been meticulous about keeping records. Every bill, every receipt, every document carefully filed in manila folders that now covered her dining room table like pieces of a massive puzzle I didn't want to solve. 3 days had passed since the funeral, and I was already exhausted from sorting through a lifetime of memories. My grandmother had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 5, and now, at 28, I was the sole heir to her modest estate. The lawyer had been clear. Everything needed to be organized before we could proceed with probate. I reached for another folder marked Medical Records, Family, and immediately felt the weight of thick documentation inside. My grandmother had always been paranoid about medical paperwork, insisting that hospitals made mistakes and that we needed to keep our own records. "Never trust them completely, David," she'd always said. "They're just people, and people make errors." The folder contained the expected items: vaccination records, my old pediatric files, copies of insurance claims. But as I flipped through the chronologically organized documents, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. There, paperclipped to my original birth certificate from St. Mary's General Hospital, was another document I'd never seen before. The header read, "Certificate of Death," in bold, official lettering. My hands trembled as I read the details. Name: David Michael Chen. Date of birth: October 15th, 1995. Date of death: October 15th, 1995. Place of death: St. Mary's General Hospital, Chicago, Illinois. Cause of death: respiratory failure, complications from premature birth. Time of death: 11:47 p.m. I stared at the document, reading it over and over again. According to this certificate, I had died on the day I was born. The same hospital that had issued my birth certificate at 11:15 p.m. had apparently issued my death certificate just 32 minutes later. My social security number was listed correctly. My grandmother's name appeared as informant on the death certificate. Every detail matched my actual information perfectly, except for one impossible fact: I was very much alive. The room suddenly felt suffocating. I stumbled to the kitchen, my mind racing with questions that had no logical answers. How could two official documents from the same hospital contradict each other so completely? Why had my grandmother kept this hidden from me for 28 years? And most disturbing of all, if David Michael Chen had died that night in 1995, then who was I? I called St. Mary's General Hospital immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. The administrative office was closed for the evening, but I left a detailed voicemail explaining the situation and requesting an urgent callback. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat in my grandmother's living room, staring at both documents under the lamplight, searching for signs of forgery or clerical errors. The next morning brought no relief. St. Mary's Records Department returned my call, and I spoke with a supervisor named Patricia Wells who sounded genuinely confused by my inquiry. "Mr. Chen, I'm looking at our database right now, and I see your birth record from October 15th, 1995. There's no corresponding death certificate in our system for anyone with your name and birth date. Are you certain the document came from our hospital?" I described every detail of the death certificate, including the doctor's signature and the official hospital seal. Patricia put me on hold for nearly 15 minutes before returning with a different tone in her voice. "Sir, I need you to bring both documents to the hospital immediately. I'm going to connect you with our risk management department. This is something we need to investigate right away." 2 hours later, I sat in a sterile conference room at St. Mary's General Hospital, the same building where I'd apparently been both born and declared dead 28 years earlier. Across from me sat Patricia Wells, a nervous-looking woman in her 50s, and Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the current chief of medical records. Dr. Hawthorne examined both documents with a magnifying glass, checking watermarks, signatures, and serial numbers. His expression grew increasingly grave as he worked. "Mr. Chen," he finally said, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Are you absolutely certain these documents came from your grandmother's papers? Is there any possibility someone else might have had access to them?" "My grandmother organized everything herself. She lived alone and was very private about her paperwork." "What are you seeing?" Dr. Hawthorne exchanged a glance with Patricia before responding. "Both documents appear to be authentic. The paper stock, the seal, even the signature, everything matches our records from 1995. But here's what's troubling. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who was indeed working in our neonatal intensive care unit that night." My heart began racing. "So it's real." "The signature is genuine, the format is correct, and the document number falls within the proper sequence for October 1995. But according to our current database, no death certificate was ever issued for David Michael Chen. Either someone has expertly forged this document using authentic materials and signatures, or what?" Patricia leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or there was a death certificate issued that night, and somehow it was removed from our official records." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dr. Hawthorne cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Chen, I need to be completely transparent with you. In 1995, St. Mary's General Hospital was going through a very difficult period. We had several investigations into billing irregularities and questions about our neonatal care protocols. If this death certificate is authentic, and if it was somehow suppressed or removed from our records, we're looking at a very serious situation." I felt like the world was shifting beneath my feet. What kind of situation? The kind that involves lawyers, investigators, and potentially criminal charges. The kind that destroyed careers and closed departments. Dr. Hawthorne paused, studying my face carefully. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you directly. What do you know about your birth? What did your grandmother tell you about that night?" I realized with growing horror that my grandmother had never actually told me details about my birth. Whenever I'd asked as a child, she'd simply said it was complicated and that I was a miracle baby. I'd always assumed she meant I was premature or had some minor complications. She never talked about it specifically. She just said I was lucky to be alive and that the doctors worked very hard to save me. Dr. Hawthorne and Patricia exchanged another meaningful look. "Mr. Chen, I think you need to understand something about St. Mary's General Hospital in 1995. We were part of a larger medical network that was later investigated for insurance fraud, identity manipulation, and illegal adoption practices. The investigation led to criminal charges against several staff members and the complete restructuring of our administration." The room began spinning. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if your death certificate is authentic, then someone at this hospital officially declared you dead on the night you were born. But you're obviously alive, which means either the certificate is fraudulent, or—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "or someone arranged for David Michael Chen to officially die while ensuring the actual baby survived under a false identity." Patricia added quietly, "Mr. Chen, we need to contact the authorities. If what we're looking at is evidence of identity fraud from 1995, there could be other victims. There could be families who never found their children, and children who never learned their true identities." I stared at both documents spread across the table. My birth certificate and my death certificate, issued 32 minutes apart by the same hospital. In that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life might be a carefully constructed lie. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Dr. Hawthorne stood up and walked to the window overlooking the hospital parking lot. Now we find out who David Michael Chen really was, and who you really are. But I need to warn you, Mr. Chen, some truths are more dangerous than the lies they replace. As I left St. Mary's General Hospital that day, carrying photocopies of documents that shouldn't exist, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The October sky had turned a threatening gray, and the wind carried the smell of rain and something else, something that reminded me of my grandmother's final words before she died. "David," she had whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "if anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll be careful about digging into the past. Some secrets are buried for good reasons." At the time, I thought she was just rambling due to the medication. Now I realized she might have been trying to save my life. 3 days after my meeting at St. Mary's General Hospital, Detective Sarah Morrison from the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit sat in my grandmother's living room, examining the documents that had turned my world upside down. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of focused intensity that made me understand why she'd been assigned to this case. "Mr. Chen," she said, looking up from the death certificate, "I need to be honest with you about what we're dealing with here." In 1995, the Chicago PD investigated St. Mary's General Hospital as part of a larger federal probe into medical fraud and illegal adoption networks. The case was eventually closed due to insufficient evidence and the sudden deaths or disappearances of key witnesses. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. Deaths or disappearances? Detective Morrison opened a thick file folder she'd brought with her. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the physician who signed your death certificate, was found dead in her apartment 6 months after the investigation began. The official cause was listed as suicide by overdose, but there were irregularities. She slid a photograph across the coffee table. It showed a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and dark hair, someone who looked like she genuinely cared about her patients. Dr. Rodriguez had been cooperating with federal investigators. She'd provided them with documents and testimony about irregularities in the hospital's neonatal unit. 3 days before her death, she called the FBI and said she had explosive evidence that would expose everything. She was supposed to turn over additional documents the day after she died. The room felt cold despite the heating running. "You think she was murdered?" I think Dr. Rodriguez knew something that made her extremely dangerous to powerful people. And I think your death certificate might be part of what she was trying to expose. Detective Morrison pulled out another document, a hospital employment record from 1995. Look at this. In October 1995, St. Mary's had an unusually high number of complications in their neonatal unit. 7 babies were listed as stillborn or died within hours of birth. But here's the interesting part. The hospital's billing records show that they received insurance payments for the ongoing care of all 7 babies. I leaned forward, struggling to understand the implications. They were billing for dead babies? Or they were declaring living babies dead while continuing to treat them under false identities. It's a sophisticated form of fraud that allows hospitals to double bill insurance companies and create untraceable identities for children who might be sold in illegal adoption networks. The words hit me like physical blows. "Are you saying I might have been sold?" Detective Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I'm saying your grandmother paid for a private room at St. Mary's for 3 weeks in October 1995, even though you were supposedly born healthy and went home the same day. The payment records show she was covering expenses for extended neonatal care that officially never happened." She showed me copies of canceled checks written by my grandmother to St. Mary's General Hospital. The amounts were substantial, thousands of dollars over several weeks. Your grandmother wasn't just your guardian, Mr. Chen. These payment records suggest she might have purchased you from whoever was running this operation. I felt sick. But she was my grandmother. She had pictures of my mother, stories about our family. Tell me about those pictures and stories. Be specific. As I tried to recall details about my supposed mother, my grandmother's daughter who had allegedly died in a car accident, I realized how vague everything had always been. The photos were few and always seemed to be taken from a distance. The stories were generic, lacking the kind of specific details that real memories contain. She always said my mother looked just like me, I said slowly, but now that I think about it, I can't remember any photos where I could clearly see her face. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. Mr. Chen, I need to show you something else. We ran your fingerprints through the national database yesterday. My stomach dropped. And there's no record of David Michael Chen's fingerprints anywhere in the system. No birth registration with prints, no school records, nothing. It's as if David Michael Chen didn't exist until he started kindergarten at age 6. She paused, letting this sink in. But we did find something interesting. Your prints match a set taken from a crime scene in 1995, not as a suspect, but as a potential victim. What crime scene? Detective Morrison pulled out a police report with most of the text redacted. A break-in at Dr. Elena Rodriguez's home office, 3 weeks before her death. Someone ransacked her files, looking for specific documents. The only prints found belonged to Dr. Rodriguez and an unidentified infant. The implications crashed over me like a wave. You think I was there? I think Dr. Rodriguez was hiding you. I think she faked your death certificate to protect you from whatever was happening at St. Mary's, and I think someone killed her to cover it up. Detective Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street with the practiced eye of someone always watching for threats. Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something important. In the past week, since you discovered these documents, have you noticed anything unusual? People following you, strange phone calls, cars parked outside your house. I thought about the feeling of being watched when I left the hospital, the hang-up calls I'd been getting, the dark sedan I'd noticed in my neighborhood twice in the past few days. Maybe. I thought I was being paranoid. You're not paranoid. The people involved in this operation had connections throughout the medical system, law enforcement, and city government. If they're still alive, they're still dangerous. She turned back to face me, her expression deadly serious. I'm going to ask you to consider something difficult. We need to exhume your grandmother's body. What? Why? Because if your grandmother purchased you from this illegal network, she might not be your biological grandmother. We need DNA evidence to establish who you really are and where you came from. The idea of disturbing my grandmother's grave felt like a violation of everything she'd meant to me. But as I looked at the death certificate with my name on it, I realized that my entire life had been built on lies. If she wasn't really my grandmother, then who was she? And why did she save me? Detective Morrison sat back down, her voice gentle but determined. That's what we're going to find out. But first, we need to establish your real identity. Once we know who you are, we can start figuring out what happened to your actual family. She gathered the documents and placed them back in her folder. Mr. Chen, I want you to stay with friends or family for the next few weeks. Don't go home alone, don't follow predictable routines, and call me immediately if you notice anyone following you. As she prepared to leave, Detective Morrison handed me a business card with her personal cell phone number written on the back. One more thing, she said. We're going to need to contact other families who might have been affected by this network. If there are other children out there living under false identities, they deserve to know the truth. After she left, I sat alone in my grandmother's house, surrounded by the remnants of a life that might have been entirely fabricated. I picked up a framed photo of Margaret Chen holding me as a baby, the only clear photo I had of us together from that time period. For the first time, I noticed that my grandmother looked terrified in the photo, not happy. Her smile seemed forced, and her eyes were filled with something that looked like guilt or fear. I turned the frame over and found something I'd never seen before, a small piece of paper taped to the back with numbers written in my grandmother's handwriting. October 15th, 95, 11:47 p.m. Forgive me, David. I had no choice. The exact time listed on my death certificate. As I stared at those numbers, I realized that my grandmother hadn't just known about the death certificate. She had been there when it was issued. She had watched David Michael Chen officially die and had somehow arranged for me to take his place. The question that haunted me as I packed a bag to stay with friends was simple but terrifying. If David Michael Chen died that night at St. Mary's General Hospital and I took his identity, then what happened to the real David Michael Chen? And somewhere in Chicago, did a family spend 28 years mourning a child who was still alive while raising a child who belonged to someone else? 2 weeks after Detective Morrison's visit, I stood in the cold morning air of Graceland Cemetery, watching a backhoe carefully expose my grandmother's coffin. The exhumation had been approved by a judge who understood the gravity of potential medical fraud and child trafficking. As they prepared to collect DNA samples from Margaret Chen's remains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying the only parent I'd ever known. Dr. Patricia Vance from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office supervised the process with clinical efficiency. She was a forensic pathologist who specialized in cold cases, and Detective Morrison had insisted on having the best team possible for this investigation. The DNA results will take about a week, Dr. Vance explained as we walked back to her car. We're running a full comparison between your sample and your grandmother's remains, but we're also entering your DNA into the national database to check for matches with missing children from 1995. Detective Morrison had been unusually quiet during the exhumation. As we drove back toward downtown Chicago, she finally spoke. "Mr. Chen, I need to prepare you for what we might find. Yesterday, we received a response to our inquiry about other irregularities at St. Mary's in 1995. She handed me a folder marked Confidential Active Investigation. Inside were photocopies of 7 death certificates, all issued by St. Mary's General Hospital between October 10th and October 20th, 1995. All were signed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez. All listed causes of death as respiratory failure or complications from premature birth. 7 babies, Detective Morrison said quietly, all officially declared dead within a 10-day period. But here's what's interesting. We tracked down the families of these children, and 3 of them have been receiving anonymous financial support for the past 28 years. I looked up from the documents. What kind of financial support? Monthly payments of exactly $2,000, deposited into accounts set up in the children's names. The payments come from a trust fund established by something called the Margaret Chen Foundation. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My grandmother had been supporting other families of children who had supposedly died at the same hospital where I was supposedly born. She was paying them off, I whispered. Or she was taking care of children she couldn't save the way she saved you. Detective Morrison pulled into the parking lot of the Chicago Police Department. "Mr. Chen, we need to talk to these families. We need to find out if their children are still alive somewhere, living under false identities like you were." 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a suburban living room in Oak Park, facing Robert and Linda Martinez. Their son, Carlos, had supposedly died at St. Mary's General Hospital on October 12, 1995, 3 days before my official death. They were looking at me with expressions that mixed hope, fear, and desperate confusion. "The lady detective said you might have information about Carlos," Linda Martinez said, clutching a baby photo against her chest. "She said there might have been mistakes made at the hospital." Detective Morrison had prepared me for this conversation, but nothing could have made it easier. I showed them my death certificate and explained what we'd discovered about the illegal network at St. Mary's. Robert Martinez stared at the documents with growing anger. "You're telling me Carlos might not have died? That he could be alive somewhere?" "I'm telling you that the same doctor who declared me dead also declared your son dead, And I'm sitting here talking to you right now. I paused, struggling with the implications. Mr. Martinez, has anyone ever told you that Carlos looked like he could have been your twin? Linda Martinez gasped and dropped the baby photo. When I picked it up, I understood why. The baby in the picture had the same dark hair, the same facial structure, the same distinctive eyebrows that I saw in the mirror every day. "Oh my God," Linda whispered. "Oh my God, Carlos." But I shook my head. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm not your son. The DNA tests will prove that. But I think your son might still be alive, living with another family who believes he's their child." Detective Morrison leaned forward. "We're going to test everyone. Every family affected by this network, every child who might have been switched or sold. We're going to find out who belongs where." The conversation with the Martinez family was the first of 7 similar meetings over the next week. 7 families who had grieved for 28 years, who had received mysterious monthly payments from my grandmother's foundation, who now faced the possibility that their children were alive but lost to them forever. The DNA results arrived on a Wednesday morning that changed everything. Dr. Vance called me into her office at 8 a.m., along with Detective Morrison and a federal agent named Thomas Webb who had joined the investigation. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Vance began, "the DNA results confirm that Margaret Chen was not your biological grandmother. In fact, based on genetic markers, she wasn't related to you at all." I had expected this news, but it still hit like a physical blow. "However," she continued, "your DNA is a perfect match for Robert and Linda Martinez. You are Carlos Martinez, born October 12, 1995, at St. Mary's General Hospital." The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I was Carlos Martinez. The Martinezes weren't just another family affected by this network. They were my parents. "But that means," I said slowly, "David Michael Chen really did die. Someone else's baby died, and I took his identity." Agent Webb opened another file. "We found David Michael Chen. He's alive and living in Portland, Oregon, under the name Michael Davidson. He was raised by a couple who thought they were adopting him legally through a private agency. They had no idea he was part of a stolen identity network." Detective Morrison added, "Michael's adoptive parents paid $50,000 in 1995 for what they believed was a legal private adoption. They were told his birth parents had died in an accident and that his grandmother couldn't care for him." "So my grandmother sold him?" "Your grandmother saved you both," Agent Webb corrected. "We've been investigating this network for months now, following leads from other cases. What we've discovered is that Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Margaret Chen were working together to rescue children from a trafficking operation run by hospital administrators." He showed me a series of documents recovered from a safety deposit box registered to my grandmother. The network was selling babies to wealthy families while telling the biological parents their children had died. Dr. Rodriguez was creating false death certificates to make the children disappear from official records. But instead of letting them be sold, she and your grandmother were arranging for them to be placed with families who could protect them. "Margaret Chen wasn't buying you," Detective Morrison explained. "She was paying the bribes and expenses necessary to get you away from the traffickers. The monthly payments to the other families weren't hush money. They were support payments to help them while they grieved for children she was trying to save." I felt like I was drowning in revelations. So the Martinezes are my real parents, and David Michael Chen is alive in Oregon? "Yes. And there are 5 other children still unaccounted for. 5 other families who don't know their children are alive, and 5 other people who don't know they're living under stolen identities." Agent Webb closed his file and looked at me directly. "Mr. Chen, or should I say, Mr. Martinez, we need your help. You're the key to finding the other children and reuniting them with their families. But I need to warn you, the people who ran this network included city officials, federal agents, and judges. Some of them are still alive, still powerful, and they've killed to keep this secret before. As I left the medical examiner's office that day, I carried the weight of impossible knowledge. I was Carlos Martinez, son of Robert and Linda Martinez, but I had lived 28 years as David Michael Chen, grandson of Margaret Chen. The woman I'd called grandmother had risked everything to save me from human traffickers, and somewhere in Oregon, the real David Michael Chen was living a life that should have been mine. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come. If my grandmother and Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been killed to silence them, then the people responsible now knew that someone was asking questions about St. Mary's General Hospital. And they knew exactly where to find me. 6 months after finding my death certificate in my grandmother's papers, I stood in the arrivals area of Portland International Airport, holding a sign that read, Michael Davidson. My hands were shaking, and I kept checking my phone for updates from Detective Morrison, who was coordinating similar reunions across the country. The past months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, DNA tests, and careful negotiations with federal prosecutors who were building cases against the surviving members of the trafficking network. 3 former hospital administrators had been arrested, along with 2 adoption attorneys and a federal agent who had been taking bribes to falsify documents. But today wasn't about justice or legal proceedings. Today was about meeting the person who had been living my life while I lived his. Michael Davidson emerged from the security checkpoint looking exactly like me, but different in ways that spoke to a lifetime of different experiences. He had the same facial structure, the same dark hair, but his posture was more confident, and his clothes suggested a comfortable middle-class upbringing. His adoptive parents, Joan and Richard Davidson, flanked him protectively, their faces showing the strain of recent revelations. "Carlos?" Michael asked uncertainly, extending his hand. "David," I replied, and we both laughed nervously at the impossibility of our situation. The Davidsons had been devastated to learn that their son's adoption had been part of a criminal network, but they had handled the revelation with remarkable grace. They understood that Michael was as much a victim as anyone else, and they had agreed to this meeting as part of his process of understanding his true origins. We found a quiet restaurant near the airport where Detective Morrison and Agent Webb were waiting to facilitate our conversation. It was surreal, sitting across from someone who looked like my twin but spoke with a different accent, had different mannerisms, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his identity. "I keep thinking about how different our lives were," Michael said over coffee. "You grew up believing your parents were dead, and I grew up believing mine had given me away. Neither of us knew we had living families who were looking for us." I nodded, still struggling with the complexity of our situation. The hardest part is knowing that Margaret Chen wasn't really my grandmother, but she loved me like one. She gave up everything to save both of us. Joan Davidson leaned forward, her eyes filled with tears. "We had no idea. When we adopted Michael, we were told everything was legal. We paid the fees, we went through the interviews, we thought we were helping a child who needed a home." "You were," Detective Morrison interjected gently. "The network preyed on legitimate families who wanted to adopt children. You provided Michael with a loving home and opportunities he wouldn't have had otherwise. No one is suggesting you did anything wrong." Michael looked at me with an expression I was learning to recognize as mirror of my own confusion. "Do you think about meeting your real parents?" "The Martinezes. Every day." Detective Morrison has been facilitating phone calls and video chats, but it's complicated. They've grieved for me for 28 years. I've lived 28 years as someone else's child. We're all trying to figure out how to build a relationship from scratch. Agent Webb pulled out a folder with updates from the ongoing investigation. We found 4 of the other missing children. All of them are alive, all living under false identities with families who thought they were legally adopting orphan children. The reunification process is going to take years of counseling and legal work. "What about the people who did this?" Michael asked. "Are they going to prison?" "Some of them. Others died years ago or disappeared when Dr. Elena Rodriguez was murdered. But we're building strong cases against the surviving conspirators. Detective Morrison added, "The most important thing is that all 7 children are alive and safe. Margaret Chen and Dr. Rodriguez succeeded in saving you from a network that was selling children to the highest bidders. You might not have grown up with your biological families, but you grew up loved and protected." After lunch, Michael and I walked through downtown Portland while his adoptive parents met separately with the federal agents. It was strange, talking to someone who shared my DNA but had lived a completely different life. "I studied computer science at Oregon State," Michael told me. "I work for a tech company now, designing software." "What about you?" "I became a teacher, like Margaret Chen wanted me to. She always said education was the most important thing I could give to others." I paused, thinking about the woman who had sacrificed everything for a child who wasn't even related to her. I think she knew this day would come eventually. I think she prepared me to handle finding out the truth. Michael stopped walking and turned to face me. "Do you hate her for lying to you?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. "No. I think she made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. She could have let us disappear into the trafficking network, or she could save us and build our lives on a lie. She chose to save us. But don't you want to know where you really came from? Don't you want a relationship with your biological parents?" I thought about my phone calls with Robert and Linda Martinez, how they cried every time they heard my voice, how they kept apologizing for not finding me sooner even though they'd believed I was dead. I want to try. But I also know that I am who I am because of how Margaret Chen raised me. The Martinezes gave me life, but she gave me the values and experiences that made me who I became. Michael nodded slowly. The Davidsons feel the same way. They're terrified that now that I know the truth, I won't need them anymore. Do you need them? Of course I do. They're my parents in every way that matters. But I also want to meet my biological family and understand where I came from. As we walked back toward the airport, I realized that Michael and I were facing the same challenge from different angles. We both had loving families who had raised us, and we both had biological families who had been searching for us. The trick was going to be finding a way to honor both relationships without losing either. 3 weeks later, I stood in the backyard of a house in Oak Park, watching Robert Martinez teach his grandchildren to play soccer while Linda Martinez showed me photo albums full of pictures of a life I might have lived. They had welcomed me into their family with open hearts, but they also understood that I needed time to process 28 years of missed connections. "We don't expect you to call us Mom and Dad," Robert had told me during our first in-person meeting. "We just want to be part of your life, however that works for you." Linda had been more emotional. "I knew you were alive," she kept saying. "I never believed you were really gone. A mother knows." The federal investigation had revealed that the network at St. Mary's General Hospital had trafficked more than 50 children over a period of 5 years. Most of the children had been sold to wealthy families who believed they were participating in legal adoptions. But 7 children, including Michael and me, had been rescued by the underground network led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Margaret Chen. Dr. Rodriguez had paid for her heroism with her life. Margaret Chen had spent 28 years looking over her shoulder, knowing that she was harboring evidence of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Chicago's medical and legal establishments. As I sat in the Martinez family backyard, surrounded by relatives I was slowly getting to know, I thought about the woman who had raised me. Margaret Chen had given me everything: love, education, values, and opportunities, while living in constant fear that her past would catch up with her. She had died peacefully, believing she had successfully protected me from the truth that could have destroyed both of our lives. In a way, she had. By the time I found the death certificate, the statute of limitations had passed for most of the crimes, and the surviving conspirators were too old or too frightened to pose a serious threat. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Davidson in Portland. Just got engaged to my girlfriend Sarah. You should come to the wedding. I want you to be my best man. After all, you're the closest thing I have to a brother. I smiled and typed back, I'd be honored. But only if you'll be mine when the time comes. Linda Martinez looked over at me, curiosity in her eyes. Good news. Michael, David, is getting engaged. He wants me at his wedding. Robert Martinez put his arm around my shoulder, a gesture that still felt new but increasingly comfortable. That's beautiful. You boys found each other against impossible odds. You should celebrate that. As the sun set over Chicago, I realized that Margaret Chen's greatest gift to me hadn't been a false identity or a comfortable childhood. It had been the understanding that family isn't just about blood or legal documents. Family is about the people who choose to love you, protect you, and support you when the world becomes dangerous. I was Carlos Martinez by birth, David Michael Chen by circumstance, and somehow both identities had led me to this moment, sitting with my biological family while texting my genetic twin, surrounded by the love of people who had spent decades searching for children they thought they'd lost forever. The trafficking network had tried to erase our identities and sell us like commodities. But they had underestimated the power of love to transcend deception, the determination of parents to never stop searching for their children, and the courage of ordinary people like Margaret Chen and Dr. Elena Rodriguez to risk everything to save innocence. That night, as I drove back to the apartment I was renting while I figured out where I belonged, I stopped at Graceland Cemetery. Margaret Chen's headstone was simple, bearing only her name, dates, and the inscription, Beloved Grandmother. I placed a bouquet of flowers on her grave and whispered, Thank you for everything. I understand now why you couldn't tell me the truth, and I forgive you for the lies. You saved my life, and Michael's life, and probably dozens of others. You were the bravest person I've ever known. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a familiar figure standing by another grave about 50 yards away. It was Detective Morrison, placing flowers on a headstone I couldn't read from that distance. I approached carefully, not wanting to intrude on what seemed like a private moment. Detective Morrison? She turned, wiping tears from her eyes. Carlos, I didn't expect to see anyone here tonight. The headstone she'd been visiting read, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, 1962 to 1996. She saved the children she couldn't save herself. I come here sometimes, Detective Morrison explained. Dr. Rodriguez was my sister. The revelation hit me like lightning. Your sister, Elena Morrison Rodriguez. She married young, kept her married name professionally. When she started cooperating with the federal investigation, she called me. I was just a patrol officer then, but she trusted me. She told me about the network, about the children she was trying to save, about a woman named Margaret Chen who was helping her. Detective Morrison's voice broke slightly. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should look for the children. She said Margaret Chen had a list of all the families, all the real identities. It took me 15 years to get promoted to detective, and another 13 to get assigned to cold cases. Finding you was the first break we'd had in decades. You've been looking for us all this time? I promised my sister I would find the children she saved. You were the key to finding all the others. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people whose lives had been shaped by the courage of women who had died protecting children they barely knew. Detective Morrison, Elena, what happens now? To all of us, I mean. She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since we'd met. Now you live your lives. You build relationships with your biological families while honoring the people who raised you. You help Michael do the same. You testify when the trials begin next year. And you remember that you're alive because two women decided that saving children was worth dying for. As I drove home that night, I thought about the impossible journey that had brought me to this point. I had started with a death certificate that shouldn't have existed and discovered a life I never knew I'd lost. I was Carlos Martinez, born October 12, 1995, to parents who never stopped believing I was alive. I was also David Michael Chen, raised with love by a woman who wasn't my grandmother but who gave me everything a grandmother could give. And somehow, miraculously, I was still myself, a teacher who believed in the power of education to transform lives, a man who understood the difference between truth and lies, someone who had learned that the most important families are the ones we choose to keep. The trafficking network at St. Mary's General Hospital had tried to erase my identity and sell me to the highest bidder. Instead, they had inadvertently connected me to the most extraordinary people I would ever know, a false grandmother who became my real protector, a genetic twin who became my chosen brother, biological parents who never stopped searching, and a detective who spent 28 years keeping a promise to her dead sister. As I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I realized that Margaret Chen had been right about one thing. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. But some secrets, when finally revealed, set everyone free. My phone buzzed with another text from Michael Davidson. By the way, I've been thinking about what you said about Margaret Chen. I want to visit her grave before the wedding. Will you show me where it is? I typed back, of course. I think she'd like to meet you too. After all, she saved your life as much as mine. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without wondering who I really was. I was Carlos Martinez, David Michael Chen, and myself, all at the same time, all authentically, all grateful to be alive in a world where love can transcend deception and families can be found even after they've been lost for decades. The death certificate that had started this journey was still in my filing cabinet, along with my birth certificate and all the other documents that told the story of my impossible life. But they were just papers now, evidence of a journey, not definitions of an identity. I was alive, I was loved, and I was finally, completely, authentically home. 1 year later, I stood at the altar of a small church in Portland, Oregon, watching Michael Davidson marry the love of his life. As his best man, I held the rings that would bind him to Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, just a beautiful coincidence in a story full of impossible connections. In the front row, Joan and Richard Davidson sat next to Robert and Linda Martinez. Our 4 parents had become friends over the course of the year, bonded by their shared experience of raising children who had been stolen and recovered. Detective Morrison sat in the 3rd row, wearing a dress instead of her usual professional attire. She had been promoted to lieutenant after successfully closing the St. Mary's case, but more importantly, she had found peace knowing she had kept her promise to her sister. During the reception, Michael and I gave a joint toast that we had worked on together for weeks. "A year ago," I began, "we learned that our identities had been stolen when we were babies. We discovered that we had been living each other's lives." Michael continued, "But we also learned that identity isn't about the name on your birth certificate or the family you were born into. Identity is about the choices you make, the values you hold, and the people you choose to love." "We were saved by women who risked everything to protect children they barely knew," I added. Dr. Elena Rodriguez and Margaret Chen could have looked the other way, but they didn't. They chose to act, even when it was dangerous. Michael raised his glass. "So tonight, we toast to the families we were born into, the families who raised us, and the family we're creating together. We toast to the truth that set us free, and to the love that kept us safe when the truth was too dangerous to know. And we toast to the understanding that sometimes the most important thing isn't where you come from, but where you choose to go." The applause was thunderous, but I was looking at Linda Martinez, who was crying happy tears while Robert held her hand. I was thinking about Margaret Chen, who had died believing she had successfully protected me from the truth. I was grateful that she never had to know how much pain that truth would cause, or how much healing it would ultimately bring. After the wedding, Michael and Sarah moved to Chicago so he could be closer to his biological family while maintaining his relationship with the Davidsons. I had taken a teaching position at a school in Oak Park, 10 minutes from the Martinez family home. We had dinner together every Sunday, sometimes just Michael and me, sometimes with all four parents, sometimes with Detective Morrison and her own family. We were creating new traditions for a family that had been scattered by crime and reunited by persistence. The trials of the surviving conspirators had resulted in multiple convictions and prison sentences. The victims' families had received settlements from the hospitals and adoption agencies involved. More importantly, all 7 of the rescued children had been successfully reunited with their biological families while maintaining relationships with the people who had raised them. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. The real victory was that Margaret Chen's sacrifice had meaning, that Dr. Elena Rodriguez's courage had purpose, and that 7 children who had been stolen from their families had found their way home. As I locked up my apartment that night after the wedding, I found a letter that had been slipped under my door. The envelope was addressed to Carlos Martinez / David Michael Chen, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my hands shake. Dear Carlos, you don't know me, but I was one of the nurses who worked with Dr. Elena Rodriguez at St. Mary's General Hospital in 1995. I've been following the news about the investigation and the reunification of the children. I wanted you to know that Dr. Rodriguez talked about you and Michael constantly during those final months. She called you her boys and said that saving you two had made everything worthwhile. The night you were born, there were complications. You were very sick, and the doctors weren't sure you would survive. Dr. Rodriguez worked on you for hours, and when you finally stabilized, she said, "This one is going to do something important with his life." She was right. Thank you for never giving up on finding the truth. Thank you for honoring the sacrifice she made. And thank you for proving that love really can triumph over evil. Sincerely, Nurse Patricia Williams, retired. I sat on my couch reading and rereading the letter, thinking about a woman I had never met who had fought for hours to keep me alive, who had risked her career and ultimately her life to save me from being sold to strangers. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been right about one thing. I was going to do something important with my life. I was going to teach children, help families, and make sure that the courage she and Margaret Chen had shown would never be forgotten. I was going to live a life worthy of the sacrifices made to protect it. And I was going to make sure that my story, our story, would inspire others to act when they see injustice, to protect the vulnerable when institutions fail, and to never stop believing that missing children can find their way home. The death certificate that started this journey was now framed and hanging in my apartment, not as a reminder of deception, but as proof that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in the most impossible lies. I was Carlos Martinez, David Michael Chen, and most importantly, I was alive. And there you have it. What did you think of this story about stolen identity and medical conspiracy? Leave your comment below telling me your opinion. Hit that like button if this story moved you emotionally, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories that will touch your feelings. What part impacted you the most?